But here's here's the thing that but here's the thing is last year during COVID, person after person after person died without their family there, without their wife there, without their children there. And it was hard. It was the hardest year of my life in ministry as a chaplain. And so since today is about rituals, I just want to tell you quickly a ritual that I would use to try to help those families that whose grief was complicated by the fact that they could not be there when the person they loved died. Um, and it was simple, and yet each time it seemed to have a profound effect. So what I would do, um, the first thing we would do, we'd use a cell phone, or we'd use an iPhone or an iPad. We would try to use FaceTime as much as we could so that they could at least see the person. Often the family was downstairs, outside, waiting. I would be running up and down, back and forth, back and forth. But the thing that they all talked about was I should have been there for them. I should have been there with them. I wanted to be with them. I did not want them to die alone. Now, from a practical sense, that's here's a part of that I think is worth explaining is that, almost always the person that is dying has no comprehension of what's happening around them. Uh, Sight, sound, there's so much we don't understand about it, but are they even aware that we're in the room? So is that for them or is it for me? I think it's worth acknowledging that that our absence may not be something that they're even aware of. So I think that's worth mentioning. And yet it happens every time. I wasn't there. I wasn't there. Here's this thing. It gets huge and it complicates the grief. And so here's what I would do with those families when that was the thing they were having trouble with. I would say simply, have a conversation with the person that died. So if it was dad, or if it was mom or brother, sister, whoever, talk to them and tell them what you're feeling. And it would sound like this: Dad, I am sorry that I was not there with you. I am sorry that I could not be with you. Now, we're not going to go into all the theological uh, uh, dynamics of having conversations with the dead. That's not what we're doing here. We're imagining a conversation with the person that we just lost. And we're expressing to them our sadness, sometimes our anger. It would sound like this: you're not going to believe it, Dad, but they would not let me upstairs to be with you. And I stood out in the parking lot while you were dying, and they would not let me in. Sometimes it was anger, sometimes it was sadness, but it was always this remorse. I wish that I could have been with you, and I'm sorry that I wasn't. And then after they would say that, then I would say, okay, now you know this person, you love them, you lived your life with them. What is their response? And the response would be something like this: it's okay. Uh, I would rather you be safe. I would rather you not. Uh, I would rather you not risk your own health. I would rather you not risk the health of the nurses and the doctors and so on and so forth. It is okay. I wasn't alone. The nurse was with me. The chaplain was outside the room. Um, and it would be words of comfort, words that uh, that helped the person. That made them feel like, they were words of forgiveness. Really, I forgive you. It's okay. It's okay that you weren't there with me when I died. Now, that was the majority of the time. Other times it would sound like this: I can't believe that you weren't there. Why weren't you there? Why didn't you come and stay with me? I was all alone. And there would be guilt, and the person would hear this voice, in their head from their loved one saying, yeah, I'm angry at you. I'm angry at the hospital. And I'm and I'm and it would be words of guilt. And then I would ask this question. I'd say, well, then there's your work. You know, here's the gift you've been given is you now know, because of this pseudo conversation that you just had with your loved one, you know the work that you have to do. And guess what? It probably wasn't the first time that this person used guilt in your relationship to motivate you. I remember a daughter who wasn't there, and oh, her guilt was so profound. And I met with her outside the hospital, and we sat on a bench out there and we talked. So much guilt. I said, tell me about this. Have a conversation with your mom. What would she say? And she said, oh, my mom would, she would berate me. She would tell me, I don't forgive you for not being there. She went on to tell me about how her mom was an alcoholic. And she went on to talk about the dysfunction in their relationship. And I said, well, see, there is your work to do. There's a principle in life. The way we do anything is the way we do everything. And so for that dysfunctional, unhealthy dynamic, to think that it would disappear just because someone we loved was dying is unrealistic. It's unrealistic to expect that in this moment, all of a sudden, our relationship that's been dysfunctional would all of a sudden function in some healthy way. And so I said, there you go. There's the work that you have to do. And here's something else that I have found to be true with people as I do grief work with them. Some of these unresolved, dysfunctional dynamics that existed in their relationship with the person that they lost, they are more easily resolved after the person passes away. And this is why. The person is not here any longer to continue to hurt them with their words. They're not here to respond imperfectly and in hurtful ways. And so this person, they can imagine, there's not those words. Those words don't keep coming, those hurtful words. And here's what I always encourage the individual to do is imagine, see every worldview, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, the Muslim faith, we all have a concept that after death, in the next life, we achieve some measure, some level of perfection. So this person who did not have the capacity to love you fully when they were alive, in death, the person that they are, the person that we can imagine them to be, that person has the capacity to respond fully with full capacity and love to respond the way we always needed them to respond. Mom, I need your forgiveness. Well, son, I can offer it fully and completely, because now in the afterlife, in heaven, I'll just speak from my tradition. In heaven, I now have the capacity to love fully, to forgive fully, because what? Because I've been loved fully by God, ultimately, fully, and completely by God. And I can now offer all the love I need to, all the forgiveness that I need to. And so that person who's had this incomplete experience, who's feeling guilt, who's feeling remorse, they're now able to have a conversation with someone who's completely well and completely healed. So that's the ritual of the conversation. Have a conversation with the person that you've lost, and if you feel funny having an out loud conversation, you can take it and write it down. Write them a letter, and then imagine their response. But imagine that the person responding is now fully capable. They have absolute and ultimate capacity to respond lovingly, full of grace, and with complete forgiveness. So that's the ritual of the conversation. Now, I'll share with you one other ritual that I would do with these families. That were separated during death. They didn't get to be with the loved one. It was something that I found powerful. It was something, though, as simple as returning their loved one's belongings. So when these COVID patients would come into the hospital, they'd almost bring with them some of their things. They never took their wedding rings off, and they almost always had a cell phone. Almost always had a cell phone because that's how they were going to stay in touch with this family that could not visit. So it would be my job after the individual died. I would go downstairs, I'd meet the family outside, and I'd return to them their loved one's belongings. And sometimes it would be one person. Other times there'd be 5 or 6 people that would come or that had been out there. One time there was a crowd of about 20 people, all standing out downstairs in the parking lot. So I went downstairs with this person's belongings. We had FaceTime. They had all said goodbye. We were around on the phone. They could see the patient on the phone on FaceTime. And there they all were. I had everybody stand in a circle. And I took from this patient's belongings his wedding ring. And I said, it breaks my heart that I could not take you upstairs so that you could be in the room and be part of that experience. But I want to bring part of that experience to you. Here is his wedding ring. He wore this ring. This ring symbolizes love. This ring symbolizes commitment. This ring symbolizes relationship. It is a part of him. It is a part of your relationship with him. And I'm bringing you this ring. And then we took the ring and we passed it around the circle from one person to another. 20 different people took the ring and spoke to each other the words that they would have spoke to him had they been able to be in the room with him. And they shared those words out loud so that one another could hear. And then the ring came back to me. And then I took that ring and I repeated the vow, right? I take you to be my wife. I'm accepting that we'll have a family and I will love you. I will cherish you in sickness and in health, for richer, for poor. And I will cherish you and the family we've created until we are separated by death. And then I prayed. So we can take something as simple as an object, something like a ring. It worked with a cell phone. This phone that you had conversations with him, that you would call him on when you needed help. And that phone, that ring became a symbol of presence, of that person's presence in their life. And it would work in some measure to help them accept the fact they weren't there in those last moments. And I'll say this last thing. it's interesting to me, this preoccupation with being present, like I said, um, because those 10 minutes, those last moments of somebody's life, whether we are there or not, that does not define how much we love them or how much they loved us. That was done in the years before, those years before, where we received love, gave love from that individual. We cannot define the relationship that we have. It would be like taking any 10 minutes. My kids, I've known them their whole lives. If you went and took an hour out of the last 28 years of my daughter's life and tried to define our relationship by that 1 hour, 1 30-minute, it doesn't work. Therefore, we shouldn't put the same kind of pressure, impact on those last moments. They cannot define the relationship. What defines the relationship is the love we shared. That's what defines the relationship.
Yes. That is so beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Chaplain Roy.
You're welcome.
So that was some very special words. They're not easy to hear, but just because something's not easy um, doesn't mean that it's not good for you and healing for you. So even myself being impacted, those are tender words, but they're so healing and powerful. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. On the slide, you will also notice that the San Antonio community does have a COVID memorial in San Antonio. It is near the convention center downtown. And for those very situations, those of you who did not get to be with your loved one because of COVID. And this may not be your loved one that maybe was a donor, but um, other loved ones or other family and friends impacted. And if you can actually take a picture, you can take your phone and take a picture, a photo of that QR code, and it will take you to the website where it's actually the virtual wall as well. So it gives you some information about the memorial wall. Hearts are provided on the wall where people can actually go and write their messages or leave a photo by anyone whose life was lost to COVID. So it's really just a sacred space, you know, that has, people that have been touched by loss due to the pandemic. So I wanted to share that with you as well. So thank you so much, Chaplain Roy. That was very, very healing.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to move ahead with the second part of our workshop. And the objectives, again, we wanted you to be able to receive some supportive words for that added grief and loss that the pandemic brought into your lives. We want you to connect with other grievers virtually in this supportive setting and learn about the various types of losses in a grieving journey. There's there could be one death loss, but there can be different types of loss after that. And we want you to learn how loss impacts individuals so that way you can recognize it in your own life and also support someone that has been impacted by loss. There's healthy ways of navigating through the loss towards healing, and we would like for you to participate in a healing art tribute activity. So I always like to kind of start with an icebreaker. It's a little different when we're not in person, but there is a chat that you can put your response in. So add one word to the chat, and you could put this to Samara or you could put it to everyone. One word to the chat that would describe your pandemic experience. Takes a little bit because it's one word. But for most of you, this will come right to your mind. My one word is overwhelming. I see stressful. And the chat is at the bottom. Hate, that's a very powerful one word. And in the midst of all of that, what is one word that you are grateful for that you had last year, even in the midst of stress and loss? Is there something that you had in during the pandemic, that you're grateful you had? Peace, family, love, support. So there were some, things that we experienced, in that year, in spite of loss, that we are grateful for. Resilience comes from acknowledging the pain, but choosing to heal. That's how resilience works. You have to choose to heal. It doesn't mean it's easy, but that's where resilience comes from. I always like to touch on this. So we're going to focus more on loss, but I would like to share what grief is. Grief is an automatic reaction to your loss. This is physical, emotional, spiritual reactions, and they're natural reactions, automatic reactions. There is no right or wrong way to grieve, but you can have a healthy or an unhealthy coping with those reactions that you feel automatically. And it's usually a process that you experience. Mourning is not the same as grief. It's part of grief, but it's not the same. Mourning is how we learn to live without our loved one. It's that adjustment period where we learn to cope and live our lives without our loved ones in our life. And bereavement is our situation that we encounter or face because of the death loss. And so, how has the loss impacted us? Our life situation, our environment. That's a period of bereavement. It's that immediate situation that we find ourselves in. And loss, so all of these terms, you can use them interchangeably, but they are unique and different. So loss does have reactions, and they may or may not be as profound as your initial grief reactions. They may last longer. While they may not be as impactful or as intense, they may last longer. And these reactions can become triggered in time, maybe not right away after the loss, but it can also be long term. It could be a chronic loss. And you may not have coping skills in place for loss. And so sometimes the loss has a profound impact on an individual and on families because there's not a coping skill in place. So loss, and we're going to talk a little bit about what types of losses you can have, but the grief that comes from loss can impact your mental health and your emotional health. And that impact looks like brain chemistry responses, psychological triggers, you can have experiences that trigger emotional pain. It impacts your emotional and mental health. Spiritual impact, again, that can be religious or non-religious spiritual impact. This impacts your relationship with your faith or with God. There can be forgiveness issues, the meaning of life and purpose, and the meaning of death. And then the impact of loss can also be physical. So in your body, you could experience the impact of loss. You could have physiological responses. Those are stress responses, energy levels. The stressors can be heightened and can feel so powerful in our lives. Again, coming out of a pandemic year, each of us probably can be familiar with what a stressor feels like physically on our bodies and triggers. You know, we have gone through a lot as a community. And then the social impact of loss. This can have a direct impact on your social status, your social circles and network, relationships, those that are supporting you, support system. It can have a financial impact, and it can also impact your privacy. Because a lot of times when there's a loss, it makes everything public or everyone knows, depending on what type of loss it is. And the impact of loss on individuals also, again, it's social, physical, spiritual, mental health. I like this. I like to show you that it's like a pie because it can all happen at the same time. And that's why loss can be overwhelming at times, because it's all happening at the same time. You can't pause and say, well, let me experience and react socially to the loss. Let me stop and just concentrate on my body and how it's impacted. No, this happens all at the same time. So this personal loss, it definitely results in an impact in our own selves and our own lives. So someone else, may have experienced the same loss, but they may not have the same impact or reaction. So you have to see your grief experience as individual. And also the impact of that loss may differ. So example, my dad died suddenly, and I was 27 when he died, and it was a great impact, a great loss. But the impact was different from my brother who was 14. So our impact from the same loss, his was very unique because I was blessed to have had my father continue, raising me through adulthood. He taught me to drive. He taught me, he was at my high school graduation. So my impact was different than him not having a dad at that time to be at those things. So that's what we mean by the individual impact may differ, even if it's the same loss experience. So I lost daddy, but I didn't lose, having a dad present at my high school graduation. He did. And many factors affect our loss responses and reactions. Our own health and wellness. If you're not physically well, it's going to really be hard, to process this loss. Or you're going to feel it physically much greater than someone that's in physical wellness. The circumstances around the death or the initial loss can impact the age that you are and the age that the person is that has died. Any milestones that you're going to face without your loved one. And again, there's healthy and unhealthy coping for loss, and we may not have healthy coping for loss yet. And there's death and non-death losses. So many times a loss can result from a, an initial death loss. So there can be many losses that are as a result. But there's also non-death losses that we face and encounter. And for the example, the pandemic, you know, that has created a lot of non-death losses for us. So that's what brings us into the types of losses. So a secondary loss, this follows an initial primary death or loss. So anything that is a result of that initial death. And you may realize it right away, you may not realize it until later on after the initial death. And it impacts many areas of your life. As mentioned, my brother losing daddy, you know, he was 14, so he had not learned to drive yet, or he had not gone to get his permit yet. And so at 14, he didn't realize that secondary loss of losing his driving teacher. um, that came later, and you know, it really did impact him, you know, um, because everybody was taught to drive by dad, but he wasn't. And then here's an example, just so you can know. um, Here's an example of secondary losses and how it would impact an individual following an initial death loss. So this is taken into account someone whose spouse has died, and one, this was an interview 4 years after their loss, and one was 12 years after their loss. So they encountered some of these secondary losses later, after the initial loss. But some of them was the quality of life that they lost. That was a secondary loss, and what that looked like was a loss of income, a residence, um, either had to move out, change, or was now different residing in it. The duties that the spouse used to do, now they had to pay someone to do. Some of that extra spending cash was gone. Health insurance was gone. Retirement plans and traveling and home and savings was gone, or now had to be designated for something else. The social status, there was friends of the couple, but now um, the person felt like a third wheel. It didn't feel the same. They were suddenly single, and it wasn't their choice to be single. And they may not have been single for quite some time, so it was really challenging. Their support system changed. Their identity and purpose and their role changed. Their relationships with stepchildren and in-laws was impacted, and their self-worth and identity was impacted. They were single parenting. One was raising children alone. The other was losing the perspective of a different parent. And the grandkids weren't going to know or have the opportunity to know that grandparent. And the children were grieving as well, and also having to help in different ways that they didn't have to before. Childcare. And then also the adult children try to step in, you know, out of concern, but sometimes overstay their welcome or overprotected. And then companionship, there was personal, intimate relations and friendships that was impacted. A partner for later years in life, you were expecting to retire together and you know, share grandchildren together. That sense of security was impacted. The loss of the future, good plans and goals. Being alone at a restaurant, you know, maybe um, when the person was alive, sometimes you would eat alone because, you know, it was convenient, or you're on your way, or you're at work. Um, but when you have to do it by choice, I mean, not by choice, and because that person has died, it was different. And cooking for one less person. And this one stood out to me when they mentioned about the help in dressing, you know, that they needed someone to help zip up their clothes or help them with their jewelry or ties, and that person was no longer available. And I just, I couldn't believe that, how impactful that could be. And then the unfinished business that the deceased was supposed to help with, paperwork, um, funeral plans. Maybe they hadn't made funeral plans. Um, there was no will or inheritance, real estate, the financial debt and taxes, and maybe legal suits, and children, like guardianship and blended families. And maybe there's some kids that, the spouse didn't know about, and any unresolved family conflicts. So there is a lot. This was a long list, and this was from one person. I mean, it was several interviews, but I mean, 2 interviews, but this was a lot. So just to let you know, um, secondary losses can be very powerful, and there can be a lot of them. The physical concrete loss, these are tangible losses. These are things that you can touch, feel, have a relationship with, a physical relationship with, and their physical separation from us when they die or are lost is what hurts. That is what the loss is. So this could be a death loss of a person. This could be the loss of a home, like a fire or a natural disaster, or because someone has died and you no longer have that income. Vehicles, jewelry can be lost or stolen. Pets, they can die or be lost. Businesses or jobs. So this is something physical that you can hold. That's a physical concrete loss. Disenfranchised loss. Now I could do a whole workshop on disenfranchised loss, so I'm going to go through it a little quickly for time's sake. However, this is a big one. So, and not all of us experience disenfranchised loss, but some of us may. And it's always good to know and be aware. Anyone that experienced a COVID-related loss or a death loss during COVID, when you were not able to be with your loved one, is experiencing a disenfranchised loss. And I will explain why. But a disenfranchised loss is when your loss or your grief is not necessarily recognized or supported socially or culturally by society, or something doesn't give you permission or stops you from being able to have your grief acknowledged or recognized. You're not necessarily allowed or given permission to grieve fully. And these are losses that sometimes cannot be grieved or even acknowledged openly or publicly. And there may be some shame attached to it. So a stigma of some sort may be attached to this disenfranchised loss. And that's why COVID pandemic loss could be associated with disenfranchised loss. This impact from a disenfranchised loss, it can be more intense. The reactions that you feel, the responses to the death or the loss, it can be greater than you expected physically and emotionally. There can be depression or a lot of anger or rage due to not having the ability to express your grief or acknowledge your grief, or you have to hide it sometimes. And there may be limited social support, and there may be increased social isolation. And the spiritual, you may have restricted or limited access to the dying process or rituals. Again, that is what COVID did in this pandemic year. It did limit access to the dying process or those rituals, funeral or memorial ceremonies. But a disenfranchised loss can also keep you away from a funeral or memorial ceremony or participate in any of the decision making surrounding those ceremonies as well. So here's some examples at the bottom of some disenfranchised losses. So when someone loses a loved one that is in prison or is a criminal, or on death row, the world does not believe that anybody loves that person. They don't. They don't realize that there may have been someone there before the person made these bad mistakes, made these bad choices, got involved with drugs, that changed their personality. Um, they may have been someone prior to that mistake, and there's still someone after the mistake. But so people usually don't have any empathy or compassion for the family members or friends, of an inmate or a criminal. And a miscarriage or abortion, people may not, society may not recognize the pain associated with those types of losses and may not support someone, um, that's grieving that type of loss. Any unrecognized or unacceptable relationships, and if someone dies, like if someone was having an affair, the person that was married, the spouse would not at all probably provide any permission or access to the funeral, and people wouldn't think that that person deserved time to grieve, even though they definitely may be impacted. Some families don't recognize cohabiting partners, and estranged family members. I have seen where someone had not talked to a family member for even a decade. And when they died, people were so upset and angry that they wanted to come to the funeral and like, you weren't around during this time, so why are you going to come around? So those people don't get permission. Celebrities, sometimes people believe celebrities, don't have pain, but they're human. They do have pain. Unhealthy relationships. Someone may be in a domestic violence situation and maybe people feel that they didn't, the person that was the abuser doesn't deserve love, so you should be glad they're gone. um so that is, again, remember we talked about those secondary losses of unfinished business. So the person may be experiencing grief and disenfranchised grief. Pets, you know there is a lot more ritual, and resources and support for people that lose pets. But some people are still like, come on, why are you so sad? It was just a dog. Well, for those pet lovers, I mean, those dogs, they're your buddies. It's a hard loss. But again, you're probably not gonna give bereavement time off for a pet, even though you definitely may be impacted by their companion, your pet's loss. Homeless or severely mental ill or intellectually disabled or the elderly. Some people may feel, well, people judge the dying all the time, well, this is better for them, or, they're at peace now. And when you say things like that, I know you have good intentions, and I've saying myself too at times. And I really do feel that sense of relief that sometimes someone's at peace. Um, but the person grieving them, it kind of undermines the sense of loss, because now they're like, well, I shouldn't feel sad because they're at peace or they're in relief. So that creates a little bit of disenfranchisement. When my great granny, she was 102 and she died, everyone was like, oh, she finally got to go home, that she wanted that so much, and I bet you're happy for her. Well, yeah, but I had my granny so long. I loved sitting and talking and listening to her. So I'm still very sad, and you're not letting me be sad about losing her because you think I should be happy for her. That's what disenfranchisement is. Someone you never met. How many soldiers have gone? How many military have died, and their child was an infant, or their child was not even born yet. So someone you never met, you could love. and no one's going to give you that permission to grieve them. COVID-19 deaths, what makes that disenfranchised is that we couldn't be there, be a part. And I'm so glad that Chaplain Roy provided some helpful tips, helpful support for tending to that loss. Someone killed in the act of a criminal activity. And again, politics aside, personal opinions aside, when someone dies publicly and it's on the news, again, we always share the criminal activity and not real, and if there's a parent or a family member grieving them, you don't give them permission. You're like, well, this is why they died. Or, people judge, they deserve to die, or they died because of this. We don't know the relationship, the love that person feels, for their loved one. So we unintentionally sometimes or intentionally disenfranchise grievers. And only that griever should have a right to determine how intense that pain feels and if they are in fact grieving. So this is a really big one, and it can create a lot of conflicts and really need some support. Ambiguous losses are very traumatic losses as well. This ambiguous loss is always traumatic because sometimes you don't even know, you feel like you're in limbo. You don't know, there's not necessarily an identifiable, provable death. And you may not experience that loss as physical from society, but it could definitely feel physical to you. And the psychological impact. So someone may be physically absent from your life, but they are still very much psychologically present. So this could be like a runaway, someone that has run away, someone that is missing or has disappeared, a natural disaster where you never locate the physical body, immigration, the sudden natural disasters, all of that. So they are still very present with you, but they are not physically present with you. You cannot have a physical present relationship with them. The same with a miscarriage or a stillbirth. And then there's the opposite, those that are physically present, but are psychologically absent and cannot have a relationship with you. For example, they may be, let's see. For example, someone that has I'm sorry, my earring fell and it threw me off a little. So a person that is physically present, you are in physical relationship with them and they are alive, they are here, but psychologically you cannot have a relationship with them. So someone that maybe experienced brain damage or is in a coma, you can still physically touch them, hug them, support them. But you can't necessarily have a psychological relationship with them. Mental health disabilities, intellectual disabilities, dementia and Alzheimer's, and someone with substance abuse. So this is an ambiguous loss as well. When my grandfather had Alzheimer's and it was progressing, people would be like, "You're so blessed, you still have your grandpa." But I did have my grandpa, but he didn't know who I was. I couldn't tell him what was going on in my life because he didn't understand. And it was a loss to me and to my family. The impact on ambiguous loss, that impact is a roller coaster of emotions because you just don't know how to feel. You don't know whether to grieve or not. you don't know how to move forward with this because it's an unresolved or unsettled. I don't like the word closure, but it is true. There is no set closure. It impacts family relationships and the roles and dynamics in a family. Um, there could be someone that is having to care give, so it takes them away from certain roles that they have. Isolation, the sudden changes to adapt to, paralyzing and crippling uncertainty, because you don't know if that person's deceased or not, and it may turn out that they are. You don't know whether to grieve. You can be just kind of frozen. Um, it can't be fixed. It can't be fixed. It can't be solved. Um, then is this a loss? Or is there going to be a solution? Because we're holding on hope. This happens a lot, even with like someone facing or encountering a substance or mental health. In regards to COVID, the remnant disabilities that come from COVID, there's people that suffered some really great physical setbacks because of COVID or other illnesses like a stroke, other medical emergencies. And now they have a remnant disability. And so while you feel grateful to be physically alive, there's certain physical impact to your life. Maybe you need medication assistance. It's impacted your independence. That's also an ambiguous loss because you're like, well, is this a loss? Although I'm grateful I'm alive, is it a loss? And there's that ambiguity attached. An existential loss is a loss that results in loss of meaning and purpose. So these are more abstract. You can't really see them, you can't touch them. It's more like an ideal, and it affects our philosophies on life, our things that we assume are going to be part of our lives. And it can be painful. For example, I always use this example, like, in my family, they were very, very traditional. We were like, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby carriage. And I didn't follow that, obviously. So even though it really wasn't a loss, I am married and I do have my children, I have my family, and there wasn't not a loss, but there was a sense of broken expectations for myself. I had planned, that pattern, and it didn't quite happen. Kind of happened. I do have some love, but and then comes a baby carriage, and then comes another love, and then comes marriage and more baby carriages. So but that ideal that I had set for myself, I lost. And so these are sometimes hard to identify, um, but there's definitely existential crises that we face all the time. And just like in the pandemic, I think that was a huge existential loss for each of us. We did not expect more than 2 weeks shut down, a month shut down. We thought we have this great strength and nothing can bring us down. Wow. So that's why I put this one here. So existential loss, it's a loss of an ideal. Um, sometimes when we face trauma, life is good if you're good. What happens when life is not good, but you are good? When children die, that's an ideal that we don't expect children to die and suffer. So that can be a physical death loss as well as an existential loss. So what can help us heal from loss? We can seek support from those with common losses through counseling and support groups to address those specific losses. Churches have really wonderful social support and spiritual support. Advocacy organizations, that support particular um, victims or certain types of losses. There's social organizations that support parents that have a child with a chronic health condition. There's advocacy organizations supporting grandparents that are raising their grandchildren. You can also share your story with a trusted support network. Sharing and talking about your loss will be very helpful. Writing and journaling, even if you're just writing for yourself and not writing for anyone else. Acknowledging that loss and get help in giving that loss a voice. Again, your voice has sometimes been taken away in these types of losses, but you want to give it a voice, but not just any kind of voice. Again, just like there's healthy coping and unhealthy coping, there's healthy and unhealthy voices as well. So we want to acknowledge our loss with a healing voice. Professional counseling or trauma counseling, we want to make sure that that person is trained. We want to make sure that that person is trained and that they are able to assist us with trauma. Goodbye letters are wonderful. They usually need to be used in a therapeutic relationship or someone supporting us, but a goodbye letter can help you actually acknowledge the loss and the change of the relationship with whatever you lost. So, for example, I lost my dad when he died, but I also lost a friend and a confidant and a wise advisor and counselor for me. And so he had these different roles. And so the initial death loss was his death. The secondary loss and existential loss was daddy. Daddy was always going to be there for me. And I had to say goodbye and release that trusted advisor in my life and change that relationship with him. So then I could be able to connect with his legacy and connect and be inspired by his life versus always craving to have that face-to-face encounter, which I never was going to ever be able to have again until I die and go to heaven. So this can be very, very powerful in changing that relationship and acknowledging the physical loss. The rituals of self-care, grieving rituals, just Chaplain Roy mentioned some wonderful ones. And the spiritual care and support that we can seek from individuals in our faith communities. They can also be, friends, to provide that support. And again, self-care is to aid us in this healing journey. That way we can connect with our loved one's life and move away from the traumatic experience. So we can't stay connected to their physical life. And we can't stay connected to that traumatic experience, or we won't experience healing. And then we can also practice self-care, because when you have overall wellness, then it'll impact your ability to cope and continue to heal from that traumatic loss experience. So you can control certain things in your routine, that can gain control back in your life, certain routines with work, with eating, times that you wake up. What are some routines that you do have control over? Your physical needs: rest, food, and water. Water is very important in our healing journey, and we absolutely don't have enough of it. I will tell you that. We need more of it for sure. And then the other thing is the physical activity, exercising and walking, taking care of ourselves. Do an exercise if you can. If you can't, just at least some movement and walking. Rituals of remembrance and self-care, meditation or prayer. You have to take a break from your grief at times. You have to relax. You have to take a break. Um, you can't always actively grieve. We feel it all the time, but you sometimes have to take a break and purposely say, okay, I'm going to try and do something I enjoy today, and learn from others, what built their resilience and how did they handle loss, and what medical needs, doctor checkups and medications do I need to continue to take, and write for myself. Any deep breathing techniques, quiet time, art, counseling, the group support. This community has amazing resources out there. Some of them are still meeting virtually, but some of them are back to meeting in person. Building meaning in your life, incorporating your loved one's legacy in your life, and a healthy expressions of your feelings. There's so many unhealthy ways to express, but what are the healthy expressions? So we're going to move on to our memorial tribute part of our workshop. So if you would like to turn your camera on, again, you can, and unmute for this portion. And I'll go by and we'll say your name when it's your turn to share. So I'm going to share with you a couple of things for the memorial tribute. And Samara, if you could give access to them to turn on their video and unmute themselves. So I wanted to share with you about the acrostic poem. The acrostic poem, this is a form of poetry that each line or word in a poem uses the first letter